Ohne 3 Monate begangen sind, die Feuer, Terror, Weltleidigkeit, Vorwärts!
I'm Dr. Rick Wadge, and you're watching The World Then and Now, Episode 2, with our special guest, Dr. Dina Dye.
Hi, Rick. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm a little anxious because the topics we're dealing with that we talked about a year and a half ago are presently right in our face.
Again, I mentioned in our last episode that when I went back so we could do this series, I was just shocked I knew it was coming. I never in my wildest dreams thought it would come so quickly. And we've pulled out little pieces of the original episode to kind of show you, yeah, we're there. We got here way faster than I'd ever anticipated.
We were interested in doing this because we felt it was timely. We had no idea how timely it was.
Yeah, we really didn't.
Join us. We're going to watch this together with you. This is a clip from episode 2 of Bonhoeffer, the DVD series, and we'll be right back.
What Bonhoeffer also said was that the stupid person is stubborn. And this should not blind us to the fact that he is no longer independent. It's that he has now become dependent on that power. That's the key in all this, that the person has now become dependent on the power that has been raised up. And he has become lazy, if you will, in pushing back against that power. Bonhoeffer went on to say that when talking to a person like this, it feels like one is dealing with slogans and catchwords, and that somehow there's no person there anymore. And that this power that has come in, and that this person under the spell of this power is basically, the power has taken possession of him. And I would suggest we're experiencing much the same thing today. In fact, one of the politically correct code words that is used when you're talking to people under the spell of this power is the word racist. That is a word repeated over and over and over again, applied to just about anyone whom the politically correct totalitarians don't like. They just throw out that word racist, and nobody even seems to think about what that actually means. And so here's this idea of the person becoming under the spell of these catchwords and these various slogans. Bonhoeffer went on to say that the person is, again, like they're under a spell, that they've been blinded, that they have been abused in their very being, and they have become as a mindless tool of those abusing them. And this is the point at which they are incapable of seeing evil. And this is a scary place because I think we've arrived there. And this is the thing, when you are incapable of seeing evil, this is the thing that can destroy human beings. And again, as he wrestled with these concepts and wrestled with the reality around him, this is what he was seeing in Germany.
Yeah.
Dr. Dina Dye.
What do you say after
We're
that?
dealing with an ignorant populace.
Yeah, exactly right.
How bad? How bad is it?
It's as bad as it can be.
August 2020.
Yeah.
Here we are. We've seen the world completely turn upside down. And a lot of this, I think we would both agree, has to do with an ignorant populace.
Yeah. Well, and so recently I did a short teaching on the history of public education, and it was quite staggering. And I'll just mention there's a man no one's ever heard of, but he really is the father of public education. If we go back to the 1700s, really, the King of Prussia actually was the first to implement compulsory education. Yeah, I was, and actually, he got that from his father in the 1500s, which is quite remarkable. But that period of time, they had kids all in one classroom. This was the age designed program. They had truancy laws. I mean, this is 1700s. And then when we jump forward into the mid 1800s, the father of modern psychology, behavioral psychology, his name was Wilhelm Wundt, Wundt. He actually trained Freud, and he had influence on Skinner, Pavlov, and people like that. But the whole thrust of what he was doing was behavioral psychology. And so he actually he influenced a number of men who came over from the United States to Germany. They had something called the Leipzig Group. One of them in particular ended up at the Columbia, he actually started the psychology department in Columbia University. And another student of his ended up starting the Teachers College at Columbia, and another one at the Teachers College in University of Chicago. So this is very important because the whole idea was behavioral control. It wasn't about education. It wasn't about, the liberal arts education, but it was about controlling behavior and having certain outcomes in the classroom, because that was where it functioned. And so now we fast forward, we see people like John Dewey from the 20s, Horace Mann from the late 1800s implemented the same thing from the school of Wilhelm Wundt. And so really what our education system became was dutiful little soldiers in the classroom. The king of Prussia was training his young people to be his military. And so now we're training these young people to be a military for the global complex, the global industrial complex. So when we understand what education is, now we see that the indoctrination's been going on for more than 60 years. And so we've thrown out the Constitution. We've thrown out free market capitalism, and we've inserted the sexual education, the sexualization of our kids, all in an effort to break down all of the barriers. Because if we are free from the barriers of Judeo-Christian principles, then we go back to we can do whatever we want without responsibility. Tear down the walls, really.
And there are walls that need to be torn down, and there are walls that need to be reinforced and never be torn down.
Yes.
And we're seeing the problem is that these are walls, and the way humanity needs to function with one another, people need to be able to deal with one another that are being dismissed altogether, which is causing chaos.
Yeah.
And a lack of just basic human rights.
Well, and when we mentioned in the clip, this idea of the stupid person, basically losing all independent thinking and coming under the spell of that power. And it talked, that quote from Bonhoeffer talking about people using slogans and phrases and just throwing it out there, not even understanding what they're meaning, and coming under the spell of those slogans. And we see this. I mean, Black Lives Matter just rolls off your tongue. I mean, you got to hand it to them. They got branding down to a science, but it's working. And it's the slogan or things like systemic racism or critical race theory. I mean, most people have absolutely no idea what any of this is, and we just kind of throw that out there. We throw out racism like it's, no big deal. And then that's like the greatest threat to a person's life is to be called a racist. Did you know that phrase only came into vogue after the 60s? Up until that time, when there was an issue between cultures, you would say that they were prejudiced. But once you use the term race and racism, you don't have anything to defend yourself. And really, I don't even see the point. But we're throwing that term out, and people cannot defend themselves once you've been labeled. You lose your ministry, you lose your business, you lose your company, you lose everything once you've been accused of that. And people are using it who don't know what they're talking about.
Exactly. So a couple of things that I've observed and a couple of examples I can give. One would be that when I was in seminary working on a postgraduate degree, I remember that it had been drilled into many of us ministers that when we were preaching to our congregations, we should not exceed a third grade level
Okay.
in the way we spoke to them and the ideas and concepts we were getting across. You know, this is exactly what we're talking about. If you can't take the writings of the Bible and expound on those in a way that helps raise the bar and helps people to think about bigger, larger concepts like God. It's a pretty big concept, thinking of God, of salvation, of these different things, of how to treat one another, even if you don't like it yourself and it makes you uncomfortable. What's best for the next person? And what's best for them? Putting your neighbor first. These are concepts that are just almost void today in our society. Second is this. Racism, when I was growing up in the 70s and going to school, I believe it was the school system then that began to teach us about racism and cause it. Because we had the Black Student Union, we had the Chicano Student Union, we had the White Student Union.
Right.
Before then, Dina, we were all the same.
Right.
We didn't know there was a difference. We didn't care.
Right.
Yeah, we looked different, of course, but we didn't care. We were all the same. And by doing that and separating us, that really, I believe, created a problem and the impetus for racism within us as young people learning.
Well, and that's this whole thing of identity politics. Once you pull people out and put them in groups, then you push the groups against one another.
Yes.
I mean, it's a recipe for disaster.
It is.
So I grew up in the 60s in Canada, and, you know, it's as white as it comes. But I was the only Jew in my school. And I experienced, I mean, I didn't understand it as a young person, but later it made more sense. But as a Jew, I was discriminated against. I experienced prejudice and all of this sort of thing. But we were all, you know, we were all white. But yet as a Jewish person, you know, I was left out of a lot
Made
of
you
things
separate.
as a young person. And it was, you know, cruel and difficult. So again, you know, the 60s was ground zero for the education, and we'll talk about that after we watch the next little clip. But that is the point in which everything just shifted, and this use of the term racism came in at that point.
Okay, well, you brought it up. Let's go ahead and go
Okay.
there. So we're going to look at the next clip, but we'll be right back. I think you're really going to be challenged by this. Take a look.
Jefferson said that whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. He said that in 1789. I think many others would agree that we have doubt that modern America even has the capacity for self-governance, and really mostly because of a lack of education. We have arrived at the place of we have an ignorant population that cannot govern itself. And so, as the power base knows, that makes them dependent on the state. And now, for me, this is the first time in my life that I can see what happened in Germany, World War II, that it could happen again. Honestly, I never could understand it before. And this is the first time, again, in my life that now I can see how it can happen. And it just seems like it's happening at a pace that we can hardly believe. Washington said that the education of our youth in the science of government is vital because they are the future guardians of the liberties of the country. And that's just downright scary. Only 1 in 5 adults can name the 3 branches of government. And in fact, only 2 out of 5, they couldn't even name a single branch. Samuel Adams said the nation's freedom would be secure so long as virtue and knowledge are diffused among the people. And clearly we have arrived at a time where there is very little virtue. And so when there is just a little bit of virtue operating in the lives of people, we can stand up and take notice because it's very obvious that these people are different. And I would just say, let us be different people out in the culture, expressing virtue and wisdom and knowledge and understanding and exalting those things, the founding of our country, no matter the cost, because folks, we are already over the cliff. Civil illiteracy has led to us ignoring the Constitution or throwing it out completely. And really, folks, this is by design of the isms, the tyranny of the minority turning into the tyranny of the majority. This is all by design. Jefferson said, a nation cannot expect to be both ignorant and free. And so we must impart all of this into our children. And there, in some quarters, I would just suggest you probably have no option but to homeschool your children if you have any hope of educating them and preparing them to be leaders, future leaders of the nation. And so we have arrived at that point. The educational system has been completely taken over by radical progressives. And our kids are being indoctrinated day in and day out in every area of human life. And what it's going to produce is a nation that will collapse on itself, and something very terrifying is going to rise up in its stead.
Okay, you mentioned being over the cliff
Yeah.
in a video that we filmed, produced a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
How far over the cliff are we now?
I think we're like at the bottom. Well, and I think, we produced it a year and a half ago. I actually wrote this stuff, almost 2 years ago. My concern is we're so far over. I mean, I don't want to be a fatalist, and I believe in God. I know that He can do anything if His people who are called by His name will do their part. But you're looking at cultural changes that are endemic and cemented for generations. You don't just turn on and off a switch and have everything. Even if tomorrow the whole nation repented and fell, were flat on their face and called on God and repented, this thing ain't turning around just like that. And people have to be realistic about this, and that's really my biggest concern.
Even the trickle-down effect of the rioting and the things that have taken place within businesses shutting down because of COVID-19. In New York, it was just a few days ago that I listened to a report saying that 1/3 of the restaurants in New York will no longer be in existence. So this is a large part of the income for the states. This is a large part of the income for the individual families affected by this. So we haven't even begun to see the
Correct.
trickle-down effect
Correct.
of what's already taken place.
I don't even think my brain is capable of imagining or visually. I mean, I'm not a war gamist. People who war game and strategize can probably see where this thing is going. But in my state, for example, the suicide rate is higher than the COVID deaths. Like, the fruit of this goes beyond anything most of us can conceive. I mean, we have high suicide, we have the drug addiction, and we're dealing with domestic violence. You think of these young people that are stuck at home with, parents that might be questionable. I mean, school might have been the only place they could have gone to get some relief from it. I mean, and you look at closing down all of the sports and all of the bars. This is an outlet for young men. They don't have that. So how hard is it to go out in the street and smash windows when you've got all that pent-up energy for months and months? I mean, you saw that event in Chicago, I think it was last weekend. I don't remember what the date was, but there were 200 or 300 that went out in Chicago and just looted and destroyed in the name of reparations and caused $60 million worth of damage. So, how do these cities can't possibly rebuild? New York is a disaster. New York's not coming back. I don't care. All that commercial real estate that's empty, and like you just said, the restaurants, they said upwards of 400,000 of the wealthy have left New York. They're not going back. Why on earth would they? And my heart goes out to all the people that are left, the ones that are suffering, that can't make, this isn't going to affect the wealthy. This is going to affect the poor by design, and that's exactly what Marxism and socialism do. The divide couldn't be greater, and you end up killing your middle class, because it's the middle class that creates small business and produces. So, like you said, I mean, the damage that's been done and to the psyche of Americans
in such a short amount of
a
time.
short amount of time.
And so, as you were talking about being over the cliff, and we're talking about education in this episode of our youth, and so I'm wondering, is this a misunderstanding among church leaders that this idea of separation of church and state is so overwhelming to them and so misunderstood that they don't understand? Maybe they now more than ever have a responsibility to educate the youth in their church, not just about the Bible, but about life, about maybe our Constitution in this country. If that's not being taught in schools, public schools, maybe that needs to be the job of their religious leader, to show them this is how we live out the Bible in our own country.
Yeah, I encourage people. I mean, I would never have said this back in the 90s, but I encourage everyone to homeschool their kids. I mean, I think it's the only shot you got here. And I mean, that was one of the things when I was homeschooling my daughters, is I made sure that they knew civics. They understood how government worked. They understood the founding of our country and the value of it and how unique it was in the course of all of human history, that we were a free people governed by this document. And if we don't teach the history of our country and the history of our Judeo-Christian heritage, all will be lost. And we will be absorbed in the culture. Just think about when Israel was taken captive into Babylon. Well, the thing that they did, which was so unique, of course, they had their temple and it was destroyed, and the kingship, the monarchy was upended. But they kept they've always kept themselves as a unique community through the Sabbath,
Yes.
and through their dietary laws. But they also substituted the offering service that was once in the temple by their prayers. So they kept the glue, within their community. But we're in a place now, and of course we're a multicultural community, which I think that's been the death of us. I think anyone who is going to emigrate to the United States needed to, learn the culture, the language, the history, all of it. And by allowing people their little group and to be separated from the larger culture, we've created a nightmare.
Yes, we have.
And so I do think it's up to the church is going to have to step in and take responsibility for this.
Yes.
I couldn't agree more. And we've been, systematically conditioned, and I attribute some of that, with our mask wearing. That's a type of conditioning. There really is no reason for it. I'm sure I'll get some hate mail, and this is my opinion, but the numbers and the science do not bear this out. And yet we've conditioned people, like you can't go into a store and smile at someone or have an interaction with the clerk, by design, on purpose. And, this is, for me, this is just me, but I refuse to wear a mask. For me, it's a statement. It's a greater statement that this is some way I have control over my life, because I feel like I'm losing control, in every other area. And, I know that people who are suffering from various immune things, that's fine. But for my life, this is the one way I can say I am not going to be kowtowed in this area.
One of the statements you made earlier on in this second episode was about that the rights, the Constitution, are things that are being dumbed down, that are not a part of our public education. But what is, and what you said is sexism. That the concept of sex within early ages of kids in public school is being taught more and more, less in the home is
Right.
what I'm adding.
Sure.
And so one of the examples I want to bring up that I think we're being mesmerized by some of the big events, but we're letting some of the other events that aren't being recorded in the news slip right by us without us being aware of it. And I have an example, and that's a company that's been around since we were kids, and that's Hasbro.
Mm-hmm.
And Hasbro has put out a doll
I heard about that.
that I watched a video on that has several buttons, and you squeeze the buttons and it makes noise for little kids, and it's typical of what we had, very innocent, until you get down into the private areas, sexual areas of this doll, and when you push the button, it makes sexual sounds.
Yeah,
Now, this is for little children.
Yeah, my daughter shared that with me.
So
Shocking.
it is shocking, and so I guess my point is that we have, if there was ever a time not to put your head in the sand, it's right now.
Yeah.
We've got to be aware of what's going on, and we protest. My opinion, we protest these companies
Absolutely.
by not buying anything
Absolutely.
from them.
That is another area. You have control over your money and where you spend it. But you see, this goes back again to the 1800s. And again, everything always seems to start in Germany. Wilhelm Wundt, I mean, Marx.
Bad
Karl Marx.
theology really
Bad
began
stuff. Bad
in
stuff starts in
Germany
Germany
at that time.
But the whole emphasis was on behavioral control and conditioning. And this over-sexualization of our culture and in
Yes.
our schools is, again, our education is about behavioral control. I cannot emphasize that enough. It's not about giving your children and equipping them to go out in the world and succeed. It's about controlling their behavior and breaking down all of the boundaries that the Judeo-Christian environment creates and keeps you safe and healthy, and where society is in order. It's to break that all down. And this is about the complete collapse of our society.
Yes. And this is, we're not crying like Henny Penny crying, the sky is falling, when it's not. The sky is falling. And so it's time. Right now is the time, not tomorrow. Right now is the time to educate yourself on the issues taking place right now and how you're losing your freedoms in the American culture today. Right now, it's taking place. And so be aware of what's going on, vote your conscience, and your conscience should match what God has proclaimed very loudly, very clearly in the Bible, in the Word of God. You need to do this. You need to watch out for your family's well-being. You're the one to do this. In my opinion, it's not the state. It's not the government. It's you. You have a responsibility, and we have a responsibility to watch out for one another in this, and we can take this country back. Yes, it seems like we're over the cliff, but I believe that God may throw us a rope. But it's our responsibility to make sure that we're grabbing hold of it and we're passing this message on to our friends. Dina, last words.
Well, I think just to follow up, we've not been created to be dependent on the state. You need to think about that. And so we need to take that freedom back that God has given us. We are free under His sovereignty. And so we want to see Him back in the center of our culture.
Yes, we do. Well said. Please pass this message, this episode, on to your friends. Let's get everybody to watch this. We need to band together and do what's right. We'll see you next time.